much for this. Will give a chance for other teachers to watch and get benefit.
Inshallah.
So you will be recording from your side.
Yes, I've turned it on. It should be recording now.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rita. And welcome, everybody. I'm speaking to you from Spain. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You can hear okay, yeah?
Yeah.
And you can see the screen, right? I'm going to put up the PowerPoint. And
okay.
No, but you can't see me. Can you see me? My face?
Yes, we can see you, and we can see the screen as well.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, thank you very much for inviting me. And I wish I was there in person, but maybe, inshallah, somewhere in the future, I can visit you all again. Nick sends his greetings, of course, and this is a talk that I gave at the Hands Up conference earlier this year in London. It's a kind of, the theme of the conference was a performance, and that obviously connects with the Hands Up project and the work that Nick and others have been doing, as well as the playwriting competition, etc. So that was the theme of the conference, and I gave the opening plenary talk, and this is a kind of version of that talk. So what I'm going to do now is talk you through the presentation, and then if we have time, we can have some question and answers at the end. Is that okay with you, Rita?
Yeah, it's okay. Perfect.
Great. Okay. So basically what I want to do is I want to look at this notion of performance from various points of view. Let's just see. Let's open here we go. I think. Yep. Okay, so these are the 5 points of view I'm going to talk you through. Different ways of thinking about performance. Performance as production, as usage, embodiment, play, and drama. And I'll try to make those ideas clear. But if it's getting too complicated, just shout out and I'll take some questions. And also, if we lose the connection, of course, you know, we'll try our best to get back again. Okay, so I'm going to start off looking at performance as production. And you're probably well aware that a traditional and very much used model of language, second language teaching and English language teaching is the PPP model. The present, so this is, we're talking about grammar here, present,
you
practice it, and produce. So the production stage is the final stage of the sequence. You present, you practice in various controlled ways, and then you produce. And this is a model that was in fact introduced into methodology way, way, way back, 1976, by a man called Don Byrne. And he made the point in his book, he says, it's a pity that language learning in the classroom so often stops short at this stage, at the production stage. In other words, the teachers present the grammar, they practice it, but then they don't, there's no production stage. As he says, many teachers feel that they have done their job well if they have presented the new material effectively and given their students adequate, though perhaps controlled, practice in it. And he goes on to say, at the same, all the same, no real learning can be assumed to have taken place until the students are able to use the language for themselves. So that was the point of the production stage, the third P, if you like, in that PPP model. And I don't think anybody would quarrel or question that the usefulness of of, as Don Burns says, of having the students being able to use the language for themselves. But since 1976, people have been looking at this production stage from different points of view to say, well, what is it that makes a good production stage? What is it that learners need to be doing, which is more than just simply practice? And two researchers in Canada, some time back, identified a number of criteria for what makes a good production stage. And one of the criteria which interests me is that they said activities should be designed, these are production activities, should be designed to allow the learners to experience some of the normal psychological pressures felt by people engaged in real communication. And what does that mean, the normal psychological pressures? Well, one of the things, of course, we all know about using language, a second language, is that it's not always in ideal circumstances. We're often in situations where we don't have much time to plan what we're going to say, where we may not fully understand what people are saying to us, where we may be in a situation of anxiety or stress. So not all language use is all happy clappy, you know, take your time. And that's what they mean about the normal psychological pressures. People need to be, apart from anything else, they need to be standing on their feet. There's so many things we do in the classroom with language the students are doing sitting down. I know it's not always easy to have students moving around, but the fact that if you can get two students up in front of the class to do a dialogue or perform a role play is so much more different than doing it in pairs or in groups all at the same time. The psychological pressure is quite high. Maybe for some students it's too high, and so you obviously have to be sensitive to what students would be prepared to do. But I think if students have had a good opportunity to practice a dialogue, for example, or to do a role play, initially in groups or pairs, then they should be able to come up to the front of the class and perform that dialogue or role play. Not all of the students, obviously, particularly if it's a large class, but one or two. And the important thing, I think, is that if they know that this is going to happen, if they know in advance that they may be asked to come up and perform the dialogue, then theoretically, at least, they're going to work a little bit harder when they are working in pairs and groups. That is, they'll rehearse, they'll use the pair work stage as a rehearsal for the performance stage, which they know is going to come. So it has an important washback effect, knowing that they'll be maybe asked to perform the role play or the dialogue. I always think I watch so many classes as a teacher trainer, and I see so many good activities the students are doing in pairs and groups, but I see very few classes where the students are actually asked to come up and perform what they've been doing to the rest of the class, or just stand up where they're sitting and perform it for the rest of the class. And I think that's an important stage, because as I said, it taps into those real psychological pressures, and it prepares them also for using language in the world outside. But of course, it's not easy. And one of the teacher's jobs is to be there, giving them the assistance that they need. You see the teacher in the picture. So it's not just the students doing the role play, but the teacher is standing there and she's supporting the learners. She's providing that kind of security so that they feel a little bit more secure, more protected, and it's not so threatening. And this, of course, is very much how people learn things in the real world. I mean, if you take the example, for example, of a child learning to ride a bike, here with his or her mother, you see that the mother is right there helping the child to maintain his or her balance. And as the child gets more and more speed and more confident, the mother's role becomes less and less important. Physically, she's not even touching the child in that last picture. And of course, this is an important principle of learning all sorts of things, that we learn them through interaction with somebody who's a little bit better than we are, whether it's your mother, whether it's your brother, whether it's your sister, whether it's a friend, whether it's your teacher. But learning takes place in this kind of social context. And that's very much a principle of what you'll be familiar with as sometimes called socio-cultural learning theory. And it's associated with the Russian child psychologist Lev Vygotsky.
Yes.
So you're familiar with that, yeah? And Vygotsky proposed this notion of the zone of proximal development, that area where the child is almost on the point of being able to ride the bike, or almost on the point of being able to perform a role play, but they still need some support. And this is this notion of assisted performance, where the performance is assisted by the teacher in the classroom. The teacher is not absent. The teacher is not saying, okay, get on your feet and do the role play. No, the teacher is there to support them when they need it. Or it could be another student. So teaching, in this quotation, teaching can be said to occur when assistance is offered at points in the zone of proximal development. And we see it very clearly here. And so it's a kind of process, if you like, which is sometimes called other regulation. That is, the activity or the behavior or the skill is regulated by the mother, by the teacher, by the brother, by the sister. And then the behavior in that way can become automatic and self-regulated by the learner. So that seems to be a very important characteristic of production activities in the classroom. Not just a further kind of practice, but practice that is in real psychological conditions. That is to say, the students can experiencing a little bit of stress and tension, but at the same time, it is supported, it is scaffolded, if you like. Let's move on now and looking at performance as usage. Are you with me? Are there any questions at this point? Rita, if there are any questions, maybe you can shout them out.
Now, the scaffolding you've talked about that might be given by the teacher, if the students are working in groups, that scaffolding might be provided by more advanced classmates. Absolutely,
absolutely. And it's not just the teacher who does all the scaffolding. And in fact, there's lots of evidence that learners teach each other things during group and pair work. And this is not always the better learners. I'm sure we know that in any class there's a whole range of different abilities, and some people will be better at some things and some people will be better at others. But by doing pair and group work, they can share that knowledge and they can support and scaffold each other's learning. And that's a very good, important point. Thank you, Rita, because the teacher can't do all the scaffolding herself if it's a big class. And that's one of the values or the virtues of bringing a couple of students out to the front of the class from time to time, and then maybe their next lesson, 2 different students, and so on and so on and so on. Okay, let's move on now, looking at performance as usage. Now, Chomsky, very famously in the 1960s, made a distinction between, in terms of what a language learner knows and what they actually do with that knowledge. So he made a distinction between competence, so what the speaker or the hearer knows about the language, and performance, how that knowledge is realized in real life concrete situations. And it's been a basic distinction in linguistics for very, very many years, that competence and performance are not necessarily the same thing. And we can see that theoretically at least, when we look at transcriptions of real spoken language. So here, for example, this is from a book co-written by David Crystal many years ago. It was one of the first books or collections of transcribed authentic speech. So these are people who were recorded having conversations. They didn't know that they were being recorded even. So these are native speakers of English, adults. And I just think it's interesting because when you look at this and you see, it's so hard to understand what's going on. So I'll read it to you how it sounded when it was recorded. Well, what's the failure with the football? I mean, this I don't really see. I mean, it, because the money, how much does it cost to get in down the road now? Now, when you hear it, it's easier to understand than when you see it. But this is typical of spoken language when it is transcribed, that it looks like people are not native speakers for a start. They stop, they start, they change their mind, they hum and ha. There's lots of different disfluencies. And so this is the argument that Chomsky was making, that this is performance, but it's different from what people know. What they do with that knowledge in real time is different from what they know. And Chomsky was not interested in the performance. He was interested in the knowledge. What is this knowledge? What do native speakers know about their language? And he was, as I say, not interested in the performance. Other linguists, like Michael Halliday, said actually that messy real performance language is actually really interesting because that's what we have to deal with. And Halliday said, instead of rejecting what is messy, we accept the mess and we build it into the theory. More recently, people have been working in what are called dynamic systems theory, have said, actually, all language is performance. There is no such thing as competence and performance, a distinction. It's all about performance. And I'll just click on a bit. They use the examples from nature, or these are dynamic systems in the real world. So I don't know whether you can recognize what that is, but that's a flock of birds. And if you've seen in any of these movies or you've seen the birds yourselves, you'll know that they form these amazing patterns. And they have this ability to change and move in unison as if it was one kind of organism. And this is a dynamic system in work. There's no competence, there's no rules, if you like. It's simply it's performance, pure and utterly. And from a dynamic systems point of view, people have looked at things like, for example, how do children learn to play football? Do they read a book about it first? Do they learn the rules by heart, memorize the rules? No. The rules of the game become learnable, says Leo van Leer, in an interaction between doing it, bottom-up discovery, just playing the game, and top-down instruction. So there is some teaching. The boys who know the rules will teach and tell the others, but they will do it while they're playing it. There's no distinction between competence and performance. It's all about performance. It's all happening within the social context of playing the game. You learn the rules by playing the game. So now Leo van Leer, who wrote that, is a linguist, or he unfortunately died a couple of years ago, and he believed that language learning is similar. You learn the rules by playing the game. You learn the rules by using the language with bottom-up discovery and top-down instruction. So there is some instruction, yes, there is some teaching, but it's happening it's mixed in with doing the activity. It comes back to this thing about scaffolding again, where the teacher is helping the learners while they're doing the activity. And you can see this happening when children are playing video games. And another linguist called James Paul G was so interested in how children learn to play video games, watching his son, that he wrote a book about it. He said, what can video games teach us about learning and literacy? And one of the things that he noticed when children are learning to play a video game, very much like learning to play football, that they play the game and that they learn while they're playing. Video games operate by a principle of performance before competence. That is not competence on the one hand, the rules, the knowledge that Chomsky was suggesting, and then you perform it. No, you perform before you become competent. Players can perform before they're competent, supported by the design of the game. Yeah, so that if the game is well designed, you can learn it by doing it. And often to other more advanced players in the game or in chat rooms. Now, James Paul G, who wrote that, was suggesting that we also learn literacy in similar ways. We learn it by using it. As that comes back to my point, this is performance here is use, performing and using at the same time. Because after all, if language is learned for worldly use, that is why we learn languages, so we can use them. The learning process itself must be use-based. So this is what now sometimes called usage or use-based learning, where you learn by doing. What we used to call perhaps task-based learning or activity-based learning or project-based learning. We say you learn through the performance. So this is another meaning of performance, if you like. It's performance as use. So we've looked at performance as production and performance as use or usage. Any questions about that? How are we going, Rita? You still with me?
Yeah, right. Any questions?
I know this is a little bit theoretical for a Sunday morning, but I will try to get on to the practical implications as we move on.
But I guess that leads us to discuss one of the problems we have in classes, that we have some students who know well about the language, but when coming to the real use, they do not have the ability to talk and express what they know.
Exactly.
But they know about grammar, they know about rules, but
Exactly.
when coming to using the language, they are not that confident.
Exactly. And I don't think this is just a local phenomenon. That's a universal phenomenon. I've seen it here in Spain. I've talked to teachers in Japan who have the same problem, teachers out of Argentina. And it's this a very common phenomenon where, exactly as you say, Rida, where they have the competence, if you like, but they don't have the performance.
The performance
exactly.
level.
And that's why we need to include performance in the classroom. Let's have a look at a third meaning of what performance, and I'm just going to dwell on this briefly, and it starts to connect with play and drama, which are coming up. The notion of embodiment means, and it's an interesting kind of relatively new theory about learning and language learning in particular, that our knowledge of, we grow up in our first language, learning the language, whether it's Arabic or English or whatever the first language is, and physically growing. And the language is very, very closely related to the physical world. You can think of it, of even a verb like to grow up. We grow up, literally. And growing up is good. And people say to you when you're little, oh, how you've grown, as if it was a really good thing. Of course it's a good thing. So we start to associate the word up with positive things. And so we use a word like up to talk about things which are above us or high, but also to talk about things that are getting better. We can say things are looking up, or cheer up, or we can talk about things getting bigger also with up. So prices are going up. The cost of living is going up. It's not actually physically going up. It's a way that we see experience through our own memories of our physical development. And so this is a theory of what's sometimes called embodiment or embodied cognition. And it actually has a long history. The anthropologist Malinowski, studying the speech of Pacific Islanders, said all our meaning of all words is derived from bodily experience. And of course, you can see this very clearly with children learning their first or a second language. Here is a boy from India doing a action song. First, he's doing it in Gujarati, and then he will do it in English. So you can see how the child's learning the language through actions. And of course, you are very familiar with this as both as mothers and teachers, that so much of learning of the first language, at least, is done through action. And I'm not going to read you all this long quotation, but this is a cognitive linguist saying that the body can be rethought as an expressive instrument of the language that must be taught. It's not separate from the language. It's an instrument. And I like that metaphor. If you think of body is like a guitar or a violin or whatever that is used to express the language, and it should be involved in the learning process. I gave a talk on this subject in France recently, and one of the people who was there said, oh, this is really interesting because there's a French teacher of English in Bordeaux, and he has developed a whole system of teaching English grammar through movement. And I'm just going to show you one of his YouTube videos where they're representing through movement and mime the notion of the present perfect. And some of this is in French, so forgive me, but if you speak any, it's not that difficult, but I'll translate for you. Oh no, sorry, it's going to and will, not the present perfect. So first of all, it's quiet, it's silent, there's no sound, but you just see the gestures. And what they're contrasting here, this is going to. And this is a different gesture for will. And then there's an explanation. So what he's saying is that you see something in front of you. So there's present evidence for what this future prediction. You've got the evidence there in your hand, and then you're putting that evidence together and looking ahead. Whereas will, you see an image of something in the future ahead of you, but there's no evidence necessarily. You'll love it. So you see, and this is him himself, Jean-Rémy Lapère, who developed this whole system for all English grammar, basically, all the grammar that we teach, at least at intermediate level. And it's really quite ingenious. So the idea is that these concepts, which for some students, or many students, are difficult to grasp, particularly if they don't have them in their own language, if you physically show them the concept, if you embody the concept, there's a good chance, rather than explain the concept, or that you both embody it and explain it, this is a key to meaning, understanding. So Jean-Remy Lapierre says, language is not only about expressing meaning, but shaping meaning and performing meaning. Performing literally using our own bodies. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily that the learners will, do these gestures, etc. Although there has been some research into things like learning phrasal verbs, like coming back to up again, to eat up as opposed to eat, or to write down as opposed to write. So you write something, yeah, but if you write something down, then it has a sort of a slightly different meaning. It's there permanently on the page. And if you eat something, you eat a cake or a cookie, that's one thing. But if you eat it up, then that has the notion of completion. And various researchers have been experimenting by getting learners to gesture, to make a gesture that goes with a phrasal verb. So you eat something up, or you write something down. And apparently, by gesturing, the memory for these phrasal verbs was improved significantly. So there is something in this, and it's also, research has been done into other subjects like learning arithmetic, mathematics, etc., that when kids can gesture to show the relationship between different numbers, adding or subtracting or multiplying, etc., then their memory or their understanding is improved. So something that we might want to think about, how to incorporate gesture and embodiment into our classes. Okay, so that was the third meaning of performance. How are we going, Rita? Any questions there or comments?
About this point, embodying concepts. Learning. Do you have any ideas about that? Have you ever used that?
Yes.
Yeah, Talia?
Yes.
Okay.
I've just recently uploaded different songs about which we are been using body language and words. For example, I started using this with my listening to the I use this song which is called "Sit Down, Stand Up, Turn Around," like this. And by using the movement,
exactly,
along with the words, the first one, she
grasped
just using her body language without using any words. After that, I started hearing her saying, sit down. She says, sit down. Yeah, I feel that this is very useful.
It's an effective way of learning. So she started first doing the action without speaking, then doing the action while speaking.
And after that, I started using
your class. Oh,
yeah,
fantastic. Because you've heard of, I'm sure you're familiar with the method called total physical response.
CPR.
Exactly. And that's the basic principle underlying that learners learn through doing, particularly at beginners level, and young learners learn through performing action. So the teacher says, exactly like you described, sit down, stand up, pick up the pen, give the pen to Nadia, etc. And they learn to associate the words with the actions, and they don't necessarily speak them until they're ready. And there's, I think, a lot of good evidence that, particularly at the beginning stage of learning, that certainly that's how we learn our first language. It's through receiving instructions and directions from our parents or siblings. Fantastic. Okay, let's move on now to number 4, performance as play. And I think here you can see a connection with what we're also been talking about. And going back to Vygotsky again, he said many years ago, play. Remember we talked about the zone of proximal development, the mother and the child and the bike, learning to bicycle. Well, that intimate learning space, the zone of proximal development, can be created in play. That's why children play. They represent the world in a game or an activity which is playful, and this enables them to learn. And Vygotsky says, in play, a child always behaves beyond his average age. Yeah, above his daily behavior. So in play, children take risks because it's play. Yeah, it's trouble-free. There's nobody judging you, etc. In play, it is as though he were a head. I love this expression. In play, it is as though he were a head taller than himself. So he can push himself, or she can push herself to beyond her present competence through play. And you see this with kids playing with language. This is an example. These are two brothers. I think maybe they're twins, and they were recorded. They're English speaking, and they recorded having conversations like this. So one's called Toby, one's called David. You silly, you silly. No, Toby silly. You silly. No, you silly. No, not you silly. You silly. Do not, no silly, no silly. And this goes on and on and on. So what they're doing really is they're just playing with the language by endlessly repeating one or two words. And an example now from second language learning, a famous study that was done in the United States in the 1970s, and it was looking at how children from Mexico were being integrated into the use of English on the playground in their school. And they studied several children who were about 9 or 10 years old, who were Spanish-speaking children learning English, and noticed that in the playground, they used various strategies to help them learn language. And one of them also showed evidence of this kind of repetitive, playful use of language. So the researcher says this girl, Nora, she's called, engaged in syntactic play, grammatical play, a practice which resulted in the development of fluency and control over grammatical structures. So these are things that Nora said to herself or said to other children. She said me that, and she repeated it. She said me that it was not to raining by she house. She said it was not to raining by she house. She said she not raining by she house. Now notice it's not grammatical, but it is recognizable, a quite complex structure in English, the reported speech here. And the commentator says Nora was especially quick in figuring out which parts of the expressions in her repertoire of formulas could be varied. So she was playing with the syntax, experimenting with it in her head, but saying it out loud. And again, this seems to be a really useful strategy. And maybe something that we neglect a little in language classrooms because we're so concerned with teaching language for kind of useful purposes. Sometimes we forget that language, another function of language is simply play. One of the criticisms of the communicative approach is it is rather, what's the word, utilitarian. That is to say, it's overly functional. It's all about doing things with language, but not enjoying language for its own sake. We see this happening, though. The students themselves often subvert an activity and turn it into play when it wasn't the intention behind it. I'll just move on. This is an example of an activity I love doing with students. Is where they write rather than speak, a role play, for example, or a dialogue. So it's like chatting. They have one piece of paper, and they write something, and then they pass it to their partner, and they write a reply, and it goes backwards and forwards. So it's like text, sending text messages. And this is an example, I might have shared it with you when I was last in Gaza, of two teenagers doing a role play with a mother and a son. And so the son says, "Mum, I want to ask you something." And the mother says, "What is the question?" "I want to get a tattoo." The mother says, "Well, you can do what you want." Okay, what? "I'm going to get a tattoo," says the son. The mother says, with one condition, but it has to say, I love mum. Son says, are you crazy? Like you. I want another mother. Okay. So what you have here is children spontaneously playing with the language within a very short space of time, making a joke, taking on roles, subverting, if you like, the activity. And people have studied, a study was done in Hong Kong of teenage children who were doing role plays, and they managed to turn the role play into a little bit naughty, using English slightly indecently, if you like, but for fun. And the writers say these students managed to have a carnival type of laughter. You know what carnival is, a typical European festival when people dress up and sort of behave badly just for one day. And through populating the English language with their own local social languages and voices, they have appropriated English for their own purposes. They're using English to have fun, not for any practical, functional purpose necessarily, but in a sense to subvert it. So people who have studied play have come up with a number of conclusions about the value of play. And I'll just move on. Here are some of the advantages of play from an article that came out a few years ago. Play offers learners the opportunity to experiment with not just their own voice, but with a wider range of voices. They can play being a mother. They can play being a naughty son. So they're stretching their sociolinguistic competence. They're taking on other roles and registers. And also play offers learners the opportunity to implement a wider range of subversive language functions, things that are not usually in the syllabus, such as assessing, complaining, criticizing, blaming, chastising, etc., which they can do for fun. So they're extending their range of functions. And it offers opportunity to do conversation, which is the basis of all meaningful communication. So the mother and the son role play I showed you about the tattoo was a conversation, but it was a conversation done in a kind of imagined context. And it gives them the opportunity both to play with the language, but also to get practice just doing conversation. Okay. Last one, and the quickest one. Any questions about play, Rita?
I guess play is connected in a way or another to the third P in the PPP approach. For example, you can use play for the production phase, and it is also connected with performance.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes, they're all interconnected, and I think, as I say, and as some of the writers say, we tend sometimes to take language learning a little too seriously, and sometimes perhaps we need to relax and give the learners the opportunity to be a bit silly with the language, to play games with it, to have fun. And that can be part of the performance and the production stage of the lesson. So let's move on now to the final sort of way of thinking about performance, and before I kind of sum up. And I think this is the one that you're, through the Hands Up project, you're most familiar, performance as drama, as theater. And I'm not going to go into, I think it's sort of obvious now how valuable drama is in so many different ways, because it actually is production. So it's speaking practice, it's language in use, because drama is always contextualized, it's always situated, there's characters, and there's often sets and props and costumes, etc. They're not necessarily. But also it's assisted, it's supported, it's scaffolded, because if kids are performing a play, a drama, they have to go through all the stages of writing it, perhaps, if it's one that they've written themselves, rehearsing it, and memorizing it, learning the lines, before they actually perform it. So it goes through all those different stages. So it's very, very supported and controlled. And of course, the teacher can be there at any time to provide any assistance that is necessary. But ultimately, the idea is, of course, that the children do it completely on their own. They perform the play, they perform it online, they perform it to their peers, etc., etc. And so it's a wonderful sequence, but it also has the extra advantages of its being expressive. Drama theatre usually expresses something, an emotion typically, or a number of emotions. It can be funny, it can be sad, it can be powerful, and it can be subversive. And I think some of the results of the playwriting competition that was organized last year embodied many of those features. It wasn't just drama, it wasn't just speaking, it wasn't just production, but it was passionate, expressive, political, and deeply, profoundly engaging, both for the performers and for the audience. Now, there's not a great deal of research into the benefits of drama, but one that came out very recently in a journal called the TESOL Quarterly, which I have here. A study was done in, I can't remember which country, where, again, these were secondary school students being taught English through the communicative approach, two groups of students, both of them getting conventional lessons, yeah, but with communicative ingredients, lots of speaking practice, etc. One of the classes was also involved in performing plays, yeah, drama activities. And then over a period of 4 months, these two classes were compared. And it was found that the class that had been doing drama activities had significantly better oral fluency. The results of our study suggest that the use of drama techniques in language classrooms can have a significant impact on second language oral fluency relative to other learner-centered communicative language practices. So although both classes were getting communicative practice, the class that was doing drama activities surpassed or outperformed the class that was not getting drama activities. And then they said, not only that, what was interesting is that this oral fluency was transferable to other speaking tasks. It wasn't just that they were good at doing drama, they were good at doing speaking generally. So that was the second sentence there. Moreover, the drama techniques employed in our study appear to help learners develop strategies that are generalizable to a variety of novel speaking tasks. So it was the experience of doing drama in the classroom that really improved speaking across the board. And I think, well, that's good to know. And I don't think we should be surprised by that, but it's good to know that drama activities in the classroom are not just about students writing and performing and having fun, but they actually have a powerful effect on their spoken ability. So I'm just going to summarize now because we're getting near to 12:30. So I've looked at 5 different ways of thinking about performance. And so on the left, you've got kind of the theoretical position, and on the right, what I think are some of the applications or implications of these different ways of thinking about performance. So just to summarize then, performance as production, as the third P, if you like, in the PPP model, it seems to be important to include or to ensure that that production has a degree of psychological reality and that it is assisted or scaffolded. Then we looked at performance as usage, that separating, ignoring competence and just saying you learn a language by using it. The application of that is that as much as possible, language learning should be experiential, should be experienced through tasks, through activities, through projects, and interactive, of course, because That's what language is designed for people to interact. And then we looked at performance as embodiment. And one of the things that I draw from that is that we need to involve the whole person when we're learning a language, not just their mind, not even just their emotions, but their whole physical body. And that learning, if possible, can be enacted or should be enacted, performed, if you like, physically. And then we looked at performance as play, and noticed that one of the things about play is that it's creative. People invent things as they play. And it's also, there's an element of subversion. You are kind of, you are, in a sense, stepping outside the rules, if you like, and creating your own imagined world. And finally, we look briefly at performance as drama and how it engages fluency, but also the important point about drama is that it is expressive. It expresses emotions, and it allows the learner, therefore, to enter an imagined world and but fully supported. And so, again, has lots of benefits in terms of language learning. And so just one more quotation to finish, which seems to, for me, to capture it all. Learning is ever thus. It takes place in a social context involving action, reaction, collaborative interaction, as the learners are working together on a task, intersubjectivity. This means that you're putting yourself in the position of the person you are talking to or writing to. And mutually assisted performance. It's about performance, but it is mutually assisted. The teacher assisting the learners assisting each other. And this is a sort of dynamic view of language learning, and I think it's a good way to finish. It's good to have performance as the last word. There is my website, and there is a version of this talk on the website, and of course this has been recorded too for sharing purposes. If anybody would like more references, etc., then please, you know how to get in touch with me via Ridder. But while we have some time left, are there any questions or comments that you'd like to make? And I'll just turn off the so I can see you better. And you're still here. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I thought you.
Okay, any thoughts? Yes.
Concerning performance as a drama, I like that much as it's a good opportunity for students to put their inner feelings, inner thoughts, fears, hopes, worries, whatever, into words, translate into words that they could build up script that convey a message. In each time our students make a drama, they have a message that we must catch in.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's something that their inner sides.
Yeah. So I do agree with you, because drama impresses all the things we have discussed today. For example, it is a production of production, and it takes the language into the performance level. And if you look at the thing from a psychological point of view, you'll find your students feel comfortable talking about themselves, expressing their experiences, their feelings, because they are hidden behind different characters. They are not expressing themselves. They are talking for somebody else. So they feel comfortable talking about.
They have the message. That reflects something inside them that we should touch and catch.
Yeah.
Because in most cases they made their own drama, but gone bad independently. And in each time that was.
And I guess you scaffold your students.
Exactly.
Sometimes if they are working in groups, the students support each other.
And each time they surprise me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. It's interesting you should say that, because about 2 days ago, Nick asked me to write a introduction. You know, they're publishing the plays from the playwriting competition as in a book form. And Nick asked me to write a short introduction to the book. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but I basically say drama in the English language classroom ticks all the right boxes. And for example, it's participatory, it's interactive, it's oral, it's oral, it also involves listening. But then I said, more importantly, drama is expressive. It invests an imagined world with the thoughts, experiences, feelings, fears, and hopes of its creators. In the context of Palestine, this is an incredibly important function. It provides a means of thinking the unthinkable, of saying the unsayable, of dreaming the undreamable. And it is transformative. It empowers its creators by enhancing their English skills and hence giving them a powerful voice in the wider world, but also by construing their lives as narratives that can be performed and shared. Drama eloquently affirms their identity as Palestinians and as global citizens. So it's exactly what you were saying, in fact, and I'm pleased to hear that from you yourselves, that you see the value of drama in the classroom, and particularly in the context where you are.
Any comments? Any questions?
Sorry? Where are you at the moment? Are you in the UNRWA headquarters?
No, because of the problems UNRWA is facing now, we are in Al Qattan Center because we need stable collection.
Okay. Well, if it's any consolation, 2 days ago, the Spanish government increased its contribution to UNRWA from $1 million to $2 million. It's not a lot. It's not a lot.
It's got all the support given to UNRWA, so we need
We need money and the
and prayers. Okay.
Well, we're all thinking of you, and we're...
Another comment, just small comment, talking about drama as something done inside the class and as an extra activity given for students outside the class. So we have two separate things. Using drama in the production phase inside your class as part of your lesson, and you can use the drama as extra activities outside the class. So
Exactly. And of course, now with technology, even quite basic technology like this, for example, the drama can reach other classrooms and other countries. So this is a huge step forward because it's allowing the children to communicate and to express their lives to people who might not fully understand them. And I think that's a great benefit. And again, this is something that the Hands Up project is.
So this year we have volunteers from all over the world. So classes here, our students can communicate with others. They can do mutual work together, or they can work on the same play. So.
Exactly. And I can talk to you, and you can talk to me.
Yeah, we can spend around an hour talking. Is it?
Sorry?
Serious talking about the technical
it's very cool in our school, so that's
we can have a problem. Yeah, we'll have to work for that or to find answers.
Yeah. I think it's.
Could you send us a good connection?
So we can discuss that. It's really a problem.
It's a drama. It's a drama.
Because Gaza is drama.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes.
So where have you all come from today? Who's traveled the furthest?
So all these teachers work in Gaza area, but from different areas. Who came from the furthest area? So we give him a prize. Maybe Noha came from the beach camp. The poorest area.
Okay,
in
right.
Maybe you are German house. German. Come on. A question. Yes.
Or applying it outside of school. or subject class. I think that it's easier to make plays and make students prepared for performing plays outside school. But when it comes to the production phase, I say after, for example, at playing or presenting and discussing a grammar lesson or a reading one, how can I make it play? Or does it mean that students themselves have to make their own plays, or just a teacher prepared for students to go home, or is it a collaborative work? So how can I apply it inside my class?
Can you just rephrase the, Rida, can you, I caught some of that, but if you could just rephrase the question.
Okay. Now, Dalia is asking about drama. How can she apply that inside the class? We can do that as an activity in the production phase, because if
So
you are doing a grammar lesson, you get that. You can organize role play or drama activity to do the production phase. And even if you are doing listening lesson or reading lesson, post-listening or as a post-reading activity. Yeah, right. This is my answer, but I'm sure.
You're breaking up a bit, Rida. Yeah, having
a word to say here inside the classroom, whether it's listening or grammar or whatever. This is the question.
Okay, you're breaking up a bit. I missed some of that, but I think you've answered the question as well as asking it.
Again, stop. Okay. So again, stop. Dalia says she wants some suggestions about using drama as part of the lesson. So she's not talking about plays as extracurricular activity. How can she apply drama inside reading or listening over?
Well, I think anything that we're teaching, whether it's grammar or vocabulary, you should be able to think of a context in which you would be using that in some kind of interactive way. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm just getting a message saying that the bandwidth is low, but
no,
you can? Okay. And so just dialogues, anything, you're teaching the present, you're teaching going to, you can always think of a situation where you'll be using going to in a dialogue, like two people talking about their plans for the following weekend or the next festival or whatever. The students can write the dialogue, or the teacher can write the dialogue, and the students can perform it. But a dialogue is very basically a kind of drama activity, particularly if it's a role play. So you say, okay, you're two, not now you and you, but you are two visitors from outer space. It could be completely imaginative, or you are two adult, you're a doctor and you're an engineer and you're talking about your research plans or whatever. And the learners write the dialogue, perform it. They can use going to, and maybe you can say you've got to use 4 examples of going to. And then, but the important thing is the performing of it. It's not just the writing it and the rehearsing it, but as I said before, it's getting up and doing it. And that is a form of drama activity, very simple, just like the tattoo dialogue I showed you. Very simple, very easy, no props, no costumes, but it's putting language to real use. Can you hear me? I'm getting a message saying.
Yes, we can hear you. Any tips about applying that in large classes? Because, we have most of our classes have more than 45 students. So can be still be used? Yeah,
I mean, you're not going to be able to have every pair perform their dialogue, but the fact that they, as I said before, that they know that they may be chosen to perform, theoretically at least, means that when they're working on their dialogues in pairs, they will work a little bit harder. it's difficult. Of course, it's difficult with large classes, but even just pair work, writing dialogues and rehearsing them is possible with the teacher going around helping and assisting where necessary. As I say, the performance is the problem, but it's by choosing learners selectively over a number of different lessons, there's a chance that you give everybody the possibility.
Yeah.
And of course, they can then record their own dialogues outside the classroom using whatever means are available for recording, and that's always an option.
Okay, while you were talking, I took a note of the word you have said, pushback effect. So after spending about 20 years teaching English, and seen the tremendous effort of teaching our effort on performance rather than in competence, and using modern technique and innovative ways to relate the language more than use the language. But I always believe that there is something like a hit to our efforts when we are hit by exams. So is there any way to minimize the fact of the washback effect? Or that, for example, is there a way to make our exams focusing on performance rather than competence? Because every time that we were hit by the washback effect, so our students really enjoy the language, perform the language, but they always remember that there is an exam at the end way. So they go back to that stage where they are memorizing and they are just drilling and they are just that. A main point here, I want to give more effort for the washback effect and to make make our exams more competitive and focusing on performance rather than just being drilling or exercising or Is there any way to make our exams?
Well, yeah, what I'm picking up there, the operative word is exams, testing, etc. Obviously can have a very negative effect on teaching, because you're teaching for the exams, and this is why. And I didn't mention this, but another way that the word performance is used is in the notion of performance testing. And if you think about it, if you wanted to test somebody on a skill, so for example, whether or not they can run 100 meters in less than 2 minutes, you've got different options. What you could do if you're a medical person, you could, so you've got your runner, you want to see if they can run 200 meters or whatever. So you measure their heart rate, you take their blood pressure, you measure the strength of their legs and blah, blah, blah. That would be one way. That would be a kind of discrete item, if you like, way of measuring their ability. You look at them and you look at all the different components that go towards being a good runner. Or you could just say, off you go, run, see how far you can get. You've got 2 minutes. So in other words, you would get the runner to do the activity rather than try to measure them when they're not doing the activity. Now, the second kind of testing is performance testing. You get them to perform. So if you think about language, we do the same thing. We try to assess what the learners theoretically should be able to do, their performance, by measuring their competence. So that we give them a grammar test, we give them a vocabulary test, we give them a listening test maybe, but we don't necessarily put all those things together. If we really wanted to know whether a learner can use the language, we should really put them in a situation where they're actually using it. So this could be a role play, it could be a conversation with the examiner, and many testing systems now include a speaking component like that, an interview, role play, some kind of task. Now, it's very difficult to set up, particularly if you've got lots of learners, and it's time consuming. But nevertheless, it's the fairest way of testing, if you think about it, or it's the most, it's probably the most valid way of testing, because you're not testing what they know, you're testing with what they can do with that knowledge. Now, obviously, we have to compromise. As I say, it's difficult to do performance testing on a large scale, and it's also difficult to agree. That's the other problem between testers as to what is a good performance or not in language. Some people will give more marks for accuracy, some people will give more marks for fluency, some people will give more marks for pronunciation, etc., etc. But I think it should always be our goal as teachers, as teacher trainers, as educationalists, to try to move testing more towards performance testing rather than competence testing. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I'm just picking up on what I heard, and it seemed to be a question about examining.
Or maybe Sean says that speaking as a skill is not assessed at all.
No, exactly.
And that's a problem.
Yeah, no.
So teachers seem to neglect it, or students do not focus on speaking, although it is a very critical skill, because it's not included in the test.
Exactly.
But luckily, I can say that UNRWA is moving into a new way of assessment, authentic assessment, and they are trying to integrate speaking with other skills to be assessed.
Okay, maybe let's think out of the box a little bit. Why students shouldn't be given a chance to choose which way would like to be examined in? Maybe some of them would like to be examined orally. Some of them would like to have a written exam. Why not?
Well, I guess you have all language skills. I'm nice. Did you hear the question?
I'll tell them.
So what do you think?
Some of them could submit in oral, spoken, listening. Some of them got to write. Why not?
So addressing different styles. So
exactly. Yes. It's interesting. I mean, coming back to what you said before, Rita, about changing the testing system, that's very good news. If you're moving a speaking component, they've done a similar thing here, or in Spain, where at the end of the secondary school cycle, there's an exam that everybody sits before they can go to university. And for the first time with foreign languages, they've included a speaking test as well. Before it was all written, and the effect of that has been amazing, because it means that the teachers now are having to work on the speaking skills in the classroom, because they know that it's going to be tested in the exam. And so that's one of the good things about exams. If the exam is good, it can have a good washback effect on the actual teaching. So I totally applaud any movement in that direction. As difficult as it is, and it's not easy, but to include some kind of speaking component, that's a great step forward. Yes.
Very nice. Okay.
Can young learners, such as persons, and how?
Did you hear the question, Scott?
No, Rita, can you rephrase it?
Okay. She says, can children in grade 1 and 2, the languages are quite limited, can they be engaged in drama activities or in the production phase in general?
Well,
and
yes.
How?
I think so. I mean, it's not my area of expertise, I have to admit, but I think, in fact, you've, in a sense, got an advantage with the very young learners, because they're naturally playful. They're learning. They like actions. They love songs. They love repetition. They don't get bored by things. And so, total physical response, for example, we were talking about before, playing games where, stand up, sit down, turn around, that kind of thing. Or Simon Says, Simon Says, stand up, Simon Says, sit down, Simon Says, turn around again. And they have to do it only when they hear Simon Says. those kinds of things, they have a natural tendency to disposition for, and maybe it's harder in some respects with teenage students, adolescent students who are more self-conscious to do these kind of silly activities. So of course the disadvantage for the younger ones is that they have less English, they have less to work with. But I mean, that total physical response, all they need to do is understand the instructions. They don't have to actually to say them. So and because they're seeing the teacher perform the instructions, they can understand. It helps them understand what they mean. But there's all sorts of games and activities that involve action and music and language, and both in their first language and their second language, and taking some of those things that they do in their first language. You see, remember the little Indian boy I showed you? He was doing that little rhyme, Incy Wincy Spider climbed up the spout, doing it first in his first language, which was Gujarati, and then doing it in English. So the two languages, in a sense, are supporting each other, but the same kind of actions. So I think, and you know, I don't think we can expect young learners or beginners to be hugely creative, because they don't have a lot to create with. They have limited vocabulary and limited grammar, but we can provide them with some of the words they need for specific games and activities. And we can provide them with the text. We can write little dialogues for them, which they read aloud and then perform. So they don't have to do all the creating themselves. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I don't think it's an insuperable one. Anything else?
Okay, but how outside my classroom? I'm talking about my school, and I have our schools, yeah, we have lots of low achievers.
Did you get that question?
No, really. Can you rephrase?
Nice says that is drama just for high achievers? Can average students or low achievers be engaged in drama activities?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, it's a question of how much support and scaffolding you give them. So you're not going to do anybody any favors by saying to a student, particularly one who's not a high achiever, come up to the front of the class and act a role play like that. It has to be prepared. It has to be rehearsed. It has to be assisted both by other students and by, but the beauty of drama activities is that, in fact, anybody can participate. So the better students can take the bigger roles. I mean, this has always been the case with drama in school. I remember in my school in New Zealand, my secondary school, we performed a Shakespeare play every year. Now, Shakespeare is incredibly difficult, even for native speakers, because it's old-fashioned English, and some of the speeches are very, very long. So if you're Hamlet, you have a lot to say. But if you're just like a messenger, and you appear in one scene and you just say two things like, "Here is the letter, my lord," you're still participating in the drama, you're still participating in the theatrical experience, but you're not being pushed beyond the limits of your competence. And so, you know, at school, all the best students were given the big parts, but the other students also were able to participate just by playing the small parts. But they were always there, they were participating, they were hearing what's going on, they were part of the whole experience. So I think that's one way that drama really does cater for mixed abilities in the classroom.
I totally agree with you.
I'm not suggesting you do Shakespeare.
You can find different roles. You can they need legal, so they are obliged to support each other. The group work, they reinforce each other. Each group you get, no, they each other very well. achieve until they can master that
And
part.
they can just memorize it and just say without understanding.
Yes, that's why rehearsal and again and again, and they can master it.
But
Yes.
when they memorize it without knowing what's going on in the whole drama or play,
No, they're still
I
part
don't
of
think
it.
this is learning.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
just practicing, just like a parrot, just without knowing what's going on.
We do not want them to parrot. They are within the whole group, but they know what's going on with other parts. But their part is quite limited according to their abilities. That's what I think.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We don't want students just parroting. And that's why getting them to write their own plays, dramas collaboratively means that one assumes that therefore they are investing it with their own meanings rather than reading something that's been written for them. But I mean, I think, you know, when you think, again, going back to the example of Shakespeare, I mean, when we did Shakespeare at school, and we didn't understand a lot of what we were saying, but in some ways it wasn't a disaster. I mean, it pushed us to the limits of our competence. And you know, I don't think we have to always worry that students are understanding 100% of everything that's they're saying. It's still good for them to be up performing language that they are in the process of learning rather than language that they have already learned. That's, again, it's part of this cycle of learning through using, and that hopefully through repeated performances they will become more proficient. I'm going to have to finish now, Rita. I think it's 1 o'clock your time, 12 o'clock here.
Yes. 1 o'clock here, and teachers need to go back to their schools. Thank you very much on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much. That was really amazing.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all. Have a great day, great week, great year, and I hope to see you soon in Gaza.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.